Welcome to A&P Live Studio. I'm your host, and as a registered nurse and anatomy and physiology instructor, I'm here to guide you through one of the most critical topics in neurophysiology, traumatic brain injury. We hear the term all the time, right? But what is actually happening on a cellular level when the brain goes from this state of perfect balance to a life-threatening crisis? That's what we're going to deconstruct today.
All right, let's just jump right in with a scenario you're going to see in the real world. This is Alex. He's a college hockey player, and he just took a nasty hit on the ice. Now he's on the sidelines, and he's telling the trainer he has a brutal headache. He feels confused, and everything is spinning. So the big question for us is, what is happening inside his skull right at this moment? To figure that out, we're going to follow a pretty logical roadmap. We'll start with the brain's normal state, then dive into the injury cascade that follows a hit like that. We'll see how those initial symptoms can spiral into a full-blown crisis. And then, most importantly, we'll talk about how we diagnose and intervene to save the brain.
Okay, first things first. Before we can even begin to understand what's going wrong, we absolutely have to know what right looks like. And inside the skull, everything, and I mean everything, is about maintaining a very, very delicate balance. This entire balance is governed by a fundamental principle called the Monro-Kelly doctrine. I want you to think of your skull as a rigid, unyielding box. It can't expand. And inside that box, you've got three tenets: your brain tissue, your blood, and your cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. Since the total volume is fixed, if one of those components decides to take up more space, let's say the brain starts to swell, another one has to get out of the way to keep the pressure stable. It is a zero-sum game, plain and simple.
So what happens when trauma, like that hit Alex just took, completely shatters this balance? Let's zoom way in, all the way down to the cellular and molecular level, to really watch this injury cascade unfold.
Now, this is an absolutely crucial distinction. On one side, you have a concussion. I want you to think of this as a functional problem. It's an energy crisis. The impact creates metabolic chaos inside the neurons, but the brain's actual structure is still intact. That's why a CT scan is so often normal. But on the other side, you have elevated intracranial pressure, or ICP, and that is a structural crisis. This is a plumbing and pressure problem. We're talking about physical swelling that starts to literally compress vital parts of the brain.
A major cause of this damage is something called diffuse axonal injury, or DAI. Just imagine the brain rapidly twisting or shifting inside the skull, like from that hockey check. It creates these incredibly powerful shearing forces. These forces stretch and can even tear the axons, the long communication lines between your neurons. And this is all microscopic damage, so you won't see it on that initial CT scan, but it's devastating. It completely disrupts neural communication and kicks off this wave of inflammation, which can lead to the very swelling that drives up that dangerous intracranial pressure.
So, how does all this microscopic chaos translate into the signs and symptoms we actually see in a patient like Alex? And more importantly, how can things escalate so quickly from just not feeling right into a full-blown crisis? You have to remember, every single clinical sign tells a story. A bad headache and vomiting, that's not just a stomach bug. That's rising pressure physically stretching the protective layers of the brain, the meninges. A single dilated pupil that won't react, that is a 5-alarm fire. It's a sign the brain is physically shifting and compressing the third cranial nerve, the one that controls the pupil. Papal edema, swelling of the optic nerve, is amazing because it gives us a direct window to actually see the high pressure. And this rigid abnormal posturing, that's a really grim sign of severe widespread damage.
Now, as that pressure continues to climb and the brainstem itself becomes critically starved of blood, the body initiates this dramatic last-ditch effort to save itself. This response is known as Cushing's triad. You can think of it as a physiological Hail Mary, but honestly, it's one that often signals that a catastrophe is just moments away.
And this slide shows that vicious cycle perfectly. So look at step 1. The brainstem isn't getting enough blood flow. It's becoming ischemic. In a panic, at step 2, the body triggers a massive fight-or-flight response, cranking up blood pressure to astronomical levels to try and force blood into the suffocating brain. But then, and this is the dangerous paradox at step 3, pressure sensors in your neck detect this extreme hypertension and they slam the brakes on the heart, causing a profoundly slow heart rate, or bradycardia. This deadly combination of high blood pressure and low heart rate is a sign that the brain is in very, very deep trouble.
And if that pressure isn't relieved, well, we reach the ultimate complication: brain herniation. The brain tissue itself is literally squeezed and forced into compartments where it just doesn't belong.
The most dangerous form is when it herniates downward through the base of the skull, compressing the brainstem, which houses the centers that control our breathing and our heartbeat. This is the terminal event in untreated intracranial pressure.
Okay, so now that we understand the gravity of the problem, let's pivot to the solution. How do we, as clinicians, read these signs and take swift action based on all this underlying physiology? Our neurological exam is literally our window into the brain's function. We are not just going through a checklist. We're testing specific cranial nerves because their pathways tell us exactly where pressure might be building up. For instance, the nerve for lateral eye movement is often one of the first to be affected by rising pressure, which makes it a fantastic early warning sign. A problem with the pupillary light reflex points directly to compression from that dangerous brain shift. Each test is a targeted question we are asking the nervous system.
So, critically, our treatment has to match the underlying problem. For a simple concussion, that functional energy crisis, the goal is rest. We have to reduce the brain's metabolic demand to give those neurons time to fix their ionic imbalance and basically recharge. But for elevated ICP, that structural plumbing crisis, the goal is aggressive pressure reduction. We have to physically create more space and restore blood flow, and we have to do it now.
So how do we do that? Well, we can elevate the head of the bed to use gravity to help blood drain from the head. We can give osmotic diuretics like mannitol, which act like a sponge, pulling water out of the swollen brain tissue. We can control the patient's ventilation to manage their CO2 levels, because high CO2 causes blood vessels in the brain to dilate, which would just make the swelling worse. And in the most dire cases, a surgeon can perform a decompressive craniectomy, temporarily removing a piece of the skull to give that swelling brain room to expand.
Okay, let's take a step back and pull all of this together. Let's look at the full picture, from a perfectly healthy brain all the way to a life-saving intervention. We start in a state of equilibrium, a perfectly balanced system. Brain, blood, and CSF all contained within that rigid skull, just like the Monroe-Kelly doctrine describes.
Then, bang, the injury. Trauma completely disrupts this balance. It causes either that functional energy crisis we call concussion, or it kicks off structural swelling and edema, which starts to increase the total volume inside that fixed box. And as that volume increases, the crisis begins. The rising pressure starts to squeeze blood vessels, which compromises blood flow and leads to ischemia. This in turn triggers those life-threatening reflexes like Cushing's triad and puts the patient on a direct path toward brain herniation.
And finally, our intervention. Our treatment isn't random. It's logically and precisely aimed at fixing the specific underlying problem, either helping the brain recover from its energy crisis through rest, or physically and aggressively reducing that dangerous pressure to save the brain's very structure. So, I'll leave you with this question to think about. Knowing what we now know about the mechanics of axonal sharing and that initial neurometabolic chaos, what kind of new therapies or even preventative strategies could we possibly design to protect the brain at the very moment of impact, before the pressure even has a chance to rise?